We are living decisive times. Here in the United States, there seems to be an obvious sentiment that maybe society is not headed in the right direction. Yet even in previous generations, the same could have been said back then. In this same regard, societies in other parts of the world, particularly those we have labeled as third world countries, might have the exact same sentiment, as many struggle with collapsed societies and economies or civil unrest. Social issues such as lack of education, poverty, hunger, and homelessness have plagued the world for decades, but these problems are now being seen even here in some parts of the US. If we add to this the growing uncertainties about the future of our environment, the viability of our economic systems, and our ability to acknowledge and understand our history while keeping the peace, then societies around the world may fall into despair, degeneration, and collapse altogether. Let's face it, everything society needs to advance itself has always involved money, one way or another. However, money has failed to fully resolve all the world's problems. If there is never enough money to address the most pressing social problems, then what good is money to society as a tool? In that same analysis, if we as a society could generate, control, and manage our money supply, we could oversee a reasonable resolution to these problems at a certain time based on the current money supply and the expectation of its continued growth. But what does history teach us about money, and how does it compare to how money is conceived in the modern world we are living in? Historically, money or currency systems relied on pegging or fixing the value of the money to the value of a commodity, such as grains, salt, or more recently, metals such as silver or gold. This is known as commodity money, or a fixed exchange rate system. Most currencies today are no longer pegged to or backed by a commodity. For example, the US dollar was formerly pegged to the value of gold until 1971, as was the Venezuelan bolivar until 1930. Most currencies are now what are known as fiat currencies, which is currency whose value has been established by a government or any other economic authority. It is not pegged or backed by any commodity, but rather its value is simply accepted between parties engaging in its exchange. Many people would agree with commodity money as being more fair or real when compared to fiat money. After all, when we can see a standard amount of good, such as gold or silver, in relation to a set amount of money, there is a better idea of the money's worth. However, the problem with pegging currencies to silver or gold is that countries would be faced with limits of these supplies of precious metals within their own boundaries, meaning that eventually we will have mined all the silver or gold out of our lands and the money supply would technically be finite, not to mention the destructive nature of mining. Therefore, how can we ensure a fair representation of our money today when most currencies are no longer backed by a good or are sometimes pegged themselves to other currencies? For starters, the efficacy of a commodity currency would greatly depend on how easy the commodity is to come by. Also, the value of the commodity would have to be high enough, or at least perceived by those trading in that money system to be worthwhile. Now, imagine a town in any part of the world where all, if not most neighbors, are growing crops in their backyard. Let's call it farmland. Bob grows carrots. His neighbor Jane grows beets. And their neighbors across the street are also growing crops. Sally grows apples, and her neighbor John grows grapes. All these fruits and vegetables are technically commodities, yet in today's world, fruits and vegetables aren't really that expensive. However, if we take their nutrition into account, we can all agree based on scientific evidence that fruits and vegetables are high in nutritional value, providing us with benefits such as vitamins, antioxidants, fiber, and in some cases, anti-inflammatory and anti-cancer properties. This is where we as a company come in and say, we want to create a new currency that is pegged to the nutritional value of crops. In the hopes that the currency is long-lasting, we'll call it Phi, in reference to the golden ratio and the eternal spiral. Using the weight and density of the crop yield, however small or large, an initial value could be established. Then, multipliers that increase the value could be applied, based on how nutritious the crop is. All fruits and vegetables, if grown properly, can be very nutritious to us. However, some are more nutritious than others or contain specific nutritional properties that make them stand out from the rest. So, for example, if Jane grew 1 pound of apples and Sally grew 1 pound of beets, due to the high nutritional value of beets, the pound of beets would generate more currency than the pound of apples. Therefore, if everyone grew healthy, nutritious crops and generated a currency based on this practice, the money supply could foreseeably become abundant much quicker than we might expect. Let's say that the authority that manages this money supply generates a commission based on the amount of currency anyone generates, and over time, these commissions accrue. Eventually, the monetary authority would have a large fund which it could use to further good causes in their respective communities. Let's call this the core fund, which would essentially be much like a bank and its money supply. So while Bob, Jane, Sally, and John are all monetizing their crops in a new and more fair way, they would all also be contributing to this core fund. And to make it an honest and transparent system, the core fund would be publicly displayed in real time on site. Eventually, with such large groups of people growing crops, the food supply generated as a result of this collective effort would also predictably be abundant. So much so that if we were to stockpile all these crops at a central location, we could basically call that our farmer's market. And if at that same central location, we could have restaurants or eateries which use the same crops and ingredients that we are all growing, we could call this our very own food court. So if we develop into a society that grows its own food while generating a unique currency, and we can also eat that food that we all grew collectively at select locations, one might think that we are health-oriented people as participants in such a company. Why not then have a place to work out as well? We'll call it our own gym. And it would have perks, of course, like say, free day at the gym with every meal purchase. Of course, this would only be more convenient if the farmer's market, food court, and gym were at the same location. Let's call this our facility. And that core fund we mentioned, let's call that our bank. In order to get the crop stockpile at the facility going, we'll need a dedicated company fleet of vehicles to pick up crops from people like Bob, Jane, Sally, and John. We want to be proactive about our role in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, so as a ground rule, we'll say, we only want EV and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles for our company fleet. We'll be proud to play a part in the ongoing effort in fostering a quicker transition away from internal combustion engine vehicles. This also naturally calls for our facilities to have on-site EV charging and hydrogen fuel stations, not just for our fleet, but for our customers like you as well. While we're at it, we'll also make sure that our facilities all employ the use of renewable energy such as rooftop solar PV systems or wind turbines where appropriate. In addition to this, large-scale battery backup capabilities for the entire facility could be implemented, obtaining its charge from the same renewable energy generated on-site. And these could also power the EV charging stations, which we'll be sure to have lots of in our parking lots. To take our environmental awareness even further, all waste generated at our facilities would be processed on-site. All wastewater, as well as solid organic waste from the restaurants and eateries, would be treated and processed into compost. We'll call it our waste treatment plant. But in order to ensure that our solid waste is mostly organic in the first place, we will make a commitment to avoid the use of single-use plastics or any other plastic products at our restaurants and eateries. With waste generated on a daily basis, this makes for a continuous supply of compost over time, which we would further process and mix with soils to make topsoils. And who are the buyers of this topsoil? You guessed it, people like Bob, Jane, Sally, and John, and maybe in the very near future, you or your family. So even after monetizing crops with us, we will also be the source for replenishment or renewal of soils. Also, in the recent years, it has become known that hydrogen gas can be extracted from organic waste material, so it won't matter if we generate too much compost, we'll just tap it for some hydrogen gas. On-site hydrogen gas generation for our own hydrogen refueling stations couldn't have asked for such generosity from the earth. We believe that as people sign up to work with us as food providers, or basically farmers, eventually our money supply or core fund would allow for effortless growth and expansion as a result of continuous monetization of crops and the resulting commissions. So much so that this core fund could eventually fund specialized education programs. Let's call them magnet schools, and these would also be located within the facility. And the curriculum for these magnet schools, we'll leave that for our customers to decide based on their interests. With continuous farming from our customers like Bob, Jane, Sally, and John, and hence continuous crop accumulations, possibly to the point of having a surplus, these social issues we have been talking about, such as poverty, hunger, lack of education, and homelessness, would predictably be eliminated. Just think about it. Let's say Bob, Jane, Sally, and John were all unemployed and struggling with money, or just needed a change in their lives in which they could basically work from home. This individual farming system would be ideal, as they would be generating their own money without leaving their houses and earning a new currency whose value is just as valuable as our good health. Now, for those who are less fortunate, such as those who are already homeless, a longer-term project within our company would need to be in place to rehabilitate these individuals until they can be on their own. For this, we will need dedicated temporary housing for the people most in need. Let's call this our homeless shelter. This shelter or housing would be near spaces of land within the facility for these individuals to learn about and apply farming skills and thus generate their own money through continuous farming. Again, a timeline would be in place for these individuals to finally become independent after enough exposure to our internal system of farming, education, and health. And we may very well house hundreds or thousands of homeless over time. But once the cities or towns in which our facilities operate no longer have homelessness, these shelters or housing would then be repurposed as lodging facilities, which would then be conveniently located. We'll call it a hotel. As additional facilities start to open up in other towns or cities, we could all become interconnected with the use of emerging tunnel technologies, which we could implement in order to allow for our own underground superhighways. These would be for our internal use in the exchange and transportation of varying crops between facilities in different climatic zones of the countries we operate in, but also for your own use, to travel easily between branches or skip the traffic above. As long as you have an electric or hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, of course. We'll call it an underground express lane highway. And eventually, we could also use additional tunnels as basically large conduits to interconnect the solar and battery backup systems at our facilities in order to essentially create a large multi-town or city utility microgrid, all using renewable energy. We'll call it our utility. So here we have our local facility, complete with a farmer's market, with crops grown by you, a food court which uses those same crops, a gym whose membership requires you to simply eat at the food court, a bank with money generated from your farming, a homeless shelter for those most in need and whose buildings could one day be repurposed into conveniently located hotel facilities, magnet schools bankrolled by the core fund, on-site renewable energy generation, and battery backup capabilities for the entire facility, electric vehicle charging stations, and hydrogen refueling stations using hydrogen from our on-site waste treatment plant. And we'll travel to and from these facilities using a network of underground express lane highways, all while helping society improve itself and eliminating the many social problems that have burdened the world for too long. Some might see it as a fancy rest stop or a green mall with hotels and schools. We choose to see it as a sort of humble sphere with a hopeful and academic approach to life. For Bob, Jane, Sally, and John, and the people of farmland, this humble sphere keeps them all busy. After all, in the same way that they all farm crops for their branch, they could also work there as chefs at the restaurants and eateries, fitness instructors at the gym, finance managers for the core fund, waste handling specialists at the waste treatment plant, teachers or instructors at one of our magnet schools, or whatever other career opportunity they make for themselves there. Either way, we all need to eat, and there's plenty of people to feed for years to come. So since we will always be farming collectively and continuously, we don't anticipate our money supply to ever be a problem to make this all possible. We stand for and seek a state of perpetual balance for the earth, its resources, and its people. But we need your help to get the word out and help us become a publicly traded company. Donate now and help us make our world one big, humble sphere. And in the academic tradition of cataloging our existence using Latin names, you can call this humble sphere Sphaera Humilem.